Him. William had the luxury of a life with golden wealth. Suits, ballroom parties, fine wine, and sophisticated music were his everyday. His affluence allowed him the freedom to never step out of his safe bubble. Unfortunately, he lacked knowledge of the common everyday struggles faced by those who lived outside of luxury. His life was one that only knew what wealth could provide, ignorant to the sharp reality many others experienced. His family, too, were not particularly encouraging of him to leave the house and learn of the outside world. He wasn't the curious type, and this lack of inquisitiveness carried him through into adulthood. William's marriage just followed the same trajectory. It was exactly what everyone had expected out of his family. A rich, handsome man tying the knot with a beautiful woman from an equally privileged background and having precious golden-haired children. All elements pointed to William's life being that of conventional luxury. William stretched in his bed as the morning rays bathed his face. The bed was empty. His wife, Hazel, must have headed to work by now, and his children in school. He decided to take a break from work that day, simply because he could, and he just wanted some time to himself that day. Although he was a man who preferred to keep drinking the sweetness of ignorance and mind his own business, he wanted to do something new. He wanted to leave his home and take a walk around town, rather than travel in his luxurious car with clean shoes. William wasn't sure what compelled him to do so. Perhaps the sudden feeling of lack of inspiration and motivation. He was a writer, and as of late, he couldn't bring himself to write. He simply didn't know what to write about, which was probably why he thought venturing out into the world outside his bubble would bring about that spark again. Deciding that wearing a suit would not be the best of choices, he wore a simple black t-shirt with a jacket on top, jeans, and sports shoes. He would blend in pretty well with the rest of the crowd. William took a deep breath in, bidding the maid goodbye, as she looked at him shocked that he was going walking, and simply respectfully nodded at him as a sign of farewell. Walking out of his apartment, the busy atmosphere of the streets immediately became apparent. The town was abuzz with people busy shuffling about, pushing each other and hurrying to and from work or school. He noticed that some nearby schools had started later than others, leading to an especially busy crowd around those locations. It brought his heart some kind of comfort. It was different to his life of luxury. He made his way through the crowd, simply enjoying the people around him, the buzz in the air, and the simple feeling of being present. He had walked around town for about half an hour, in between stopping at a cafe to order a cup of coffee and a slice of cheesecake. William took a newspaper from the entrance of the cafe, and the title on the front cover read, "Economic Crisis Worsens. Whose fault is it really?" He sighed. A rich man like him was barely affected, but he can't imagine the suffering of the lesser fortunate people. He truly couldn't. Writer or not, it was simply something he couldn't grasp. William made his way out of the cafe and walked down the streets, which were a lot calmer now that everyone was in their offices, schools, homes, and doing whatever they usually do. He had only walked a few steps when he noticed a little girl leaning against a wall, trembling, dirty and thin. As he made his way towards her, he didn't know how much this encounter would change his life. Her. Life had always been hopeless for Emma. She was stuck in a situation she was powerless to escape from, feeling utterly alone and lost. Her family were not well off, and love had been hard to come by. Every night unfolded similarly, her parents arguing, followed by her father knocking back several bottles of alcohol, and eventually nodding off, with her mother silently crying herself to sleep at the kitchen table. It was a sad picture, a hopeless one. Emma's life was made drastically different at the age of 18 when she lost both her father to an untimely accident and her mother soon after to suicide as a result of grief. The darkness, fear, and grief that consumed Emma in this period was overwhelming, but Emma did not give up. Through all the sadness and despair, life taught her how to keep moving forward until there was something to move towards. Her journey since that dark time has been dedicated to finding something worth living for, some spark or sign of hope in life despite its difficulties. The spark never came, though. Months and months, Sometimes she wondered if she would be better off like her mother, but just something stopped her. Emma supposed it was simply the survival instinct of the human being. The need, want to survive, push through, even if you just know you are not going to make it through. The utter human nature to try, nonetheless. She can assume that is the reason why she still lives, despite now living on the street with no parents, no home, no love. Human instinct, that's why. The sunlight bathed her face as she woke up to a loud horn and the sound of children screaming. Her back was used to the hard alleyway cement, but it still ached. Emma glanced jealously at the passers-by as they made their way through the hustle and bustle of the streets. This was her daily routine, surrounded by noise that many people chose to ignore, while she lived in it every day. The feeling of despair and loneliness overcame her as she watched everyone go on with their lives in blissful ignorance. Was something different ever going to happen for her? Waking up to such loud noises had become her norm, and she felt numb to its presence. Hours passed and not much happened. The weather was not cold, but she found herself shivering. She didn't remember the last time she had a proper meal, and her head felt like it was splitting in half. Just then, a figure hovered over her. Emma opened her eyes slightly and saw a man, probably in his mid-30s, looking at her with concerned eyes. He held his hand out to her, and on a usual occasion, she wouldn't have accepted it. She didn't know what compelled her to, but she found herself accepting his invitation, and she did not know how much this encounter would change her life. Them. William pulled Emma's hand as he helped her to her feet. She staggered slightly as he held her. Being confined to his bubble, William couldn't imagine that people lived on the streets. The girl looked tired and haggard, as though she hadn't eaten in days. He looked at her with concerned eyes. "When was the last time you ate?" She looked at him for a moment, then at her feet, as if embarrassed. When she answers him, she still doesn't look at him. I don't know." William sighed heavily. "Come with me." William ended up entering the same cafe he had been in just moments ago. He was hyper-aware of the stares around him. He assumed it was due to the difference between him and her. Clean and dirty, smart and scruffy, rich and poor. They shouldn't be together, yet they sat together at a cafe in town on a weekday. He wasn't sure why he was doing what he was doing, engaging in conversation with a random girl he found on the streets. "What's your name?" William asked, unsure how to begin. "Emma," the girl replied meekly. He smiled warmly. "That's a lovely name. I'm William." And from there, a beautiful friendship formed no one would have perceived. During their time at the cafe, they spoke about each other's lives. It was an odd thing, the way the entire situation played out. It was as though two long-lost friends had met after several years and were not catching up, except they weren't long-lost friends. And that had been their first conversation. It was simply a gut feeling, telling them both to continue with the conversation. Emma told William all about her life, how she was not able to study, which explained why she struggled now, not only because of her family's financial status, but also because she had been diagnosed with dyslexia. And with this came other learning difficulties. In general, she was not one who was able to pick things up quickly. She spoke of how her parents would always fight, how alone she felt, as though there was no escape. Emma told him about how sometimes she wondered why she was even born in the first place. It was difficult saying it out loud, but it felt good, like taking a large gulp of water after walking in the Sahara Desert for 5 kilometers. She finally came to the point of her parents' death, how she learned about her father's accident, and her voice shook slightly as she narrated the chain of events. But when she spoke of her mother's suicide, she felt a tear drop down her cheek as she spoke it. William did not laugh or mock her. He simply held her hand. Once she was done, she asked, "What about you? What's your tragic story?" William paused for a moment. All his life, he lived in luxury and never came across any major hurdle like the ones Emma mentioned. Yes, his mother died when he was young, but that was about it. There was no specific heartbreaking tragedy in his story. Well, there's not much, really. My mother died when I was young, but from then on, my father brought me up with the help of my grandparents. My childhood was pretty okay. There's nothing interesting to it. And now I'm married with 2 kids. I actually came out today because, you see, I'm a writer, and I've lost all inspiration and motivation. But it looks like you've sparked that interest again. For that, I thank you, dearest Emma. He smiled and chuckled nervously, as if he were embarrassed that he didn't have enough tragedy in his life. I see, Emma replied. It was unfair, when she thought about it, how life worked, how others went through more than the other. Why, she wondered. Despite the seemingly unfairness of the situation, she realized the beauty of the way the world worked. Although she had all of her troubles, she got through them, stronger, better. Even if the state she was in at the moment wasn't the greatest, she still got through, battered and bruised, yet she was there, alive. Life had taught her much. The man before her, though, looked like he knew very little of the reality of the world. William and Emma stayed for longer at the cafe, until they decided it was high time they left. They left laughing at a joke William made, and he watched as the corners of her eyes crinkled, and her little body shook as she laughed. Are you full enough now? He asked. Emma smiled. Yes, thank you so much. The two stood there for a moment, just enjoying each other's presence, until suddenly tears dripped down Emma's delicate cheeks, wetting them. William looked at her, worried, wondering why she was suddenly crying. Emma, what's wrong? She sniffed and laughed while shaking her head. No, it's just, you remind me a lot of my father. He stiffened and gulped. It's not a bad thing, don't worry. My dad used to drink and yell, but I did love him, a lot. He never really yelled at me. Emma paused as she looked at the roads around her, reminding her of the life she had to return to. It was an odd day, one she will be able to tell the children who pass on the roads when she gets older, one to remain as a memory, and him a passing ghost in her life. It just made me nostalgic. I apologize. You've no reason to apologize, William replied, smiling and placing a hand on her head. She sighed. I must return now. I thank you immensely for this, sir. I shall make my way now. Goodbye. To her surprise, he held her hand before she could leave. Wait, unless you don't leave? Emma frowned, and his eyes widened. That is, only if you want to. Leave this world. I mean, leave the streets. I don't understand why nothing is being done about this. Actually, how can they just leave a child here on the streets? Emma, listen. I can speak to my wife. We can figure something out, surely. In that moment, it was as if all hope had come true. She could feel her heart beating fast and the anticipation taking over her body. All of the promises she made to herself over the years and all of the dreams she dreamed were coming together in that single moment. She could barely contain herself as her heart brimmed with hope for the future that lay ahead. A future that was full of potential and promise. It was in this moment of hope, when everything seemed possible, that she realized it was time to take a leap of faith and make those perennial dreams come true. Three years later. Them. It had been 3 years since Emma had moved into William's home as his adopted daughter. It wasn't like how it was in the fairy tales as she had expected. Wicked stepmother, wicked children. Instead, they were all lovely and welcoming. Life was slightly hard to adjust to, adjusting to the fact that this was reality and this was her new life. William had got her to do a course in graphic designing after learning she was quite the artist. It had been a mind-boggling change of events, but Emma only supposed that this was just what life was, full of change, of surprises, and most importantly, of growth. That was life.